Okay, in this vodcast we're going to take a quick look at the difference between chemical and physical properties and chemical and physical changes. This is going to be a very brief explanation of these two processes. So let me get myself a pen here and we can get started. Let's first take a look at physical and chemical properties. Basically, when we talk about the properties of a substance or the properties of a compound, what we're talking about are the things that make that compound behave the way it does. And there's two basic types. There's the physical, whoops, almost crossed it out there, and then the chemical. And it really is a very simple difference. When we talk about physical properties, we're talking about the properties of a substance that are not involved in changing the chemical makeup of the substance. For example, we're taking something like, say, salt, and it's the properties of that compound that are not involved in turning it into something else. For example, the boiling point and melting point of salt, the solubility of salt in an aqueous solution, the density, the color, the hardness. In other words, all of these things are describing salt when we're not talking about changing the compound. On the other hand, when we talk about chemical properties, we talk about properties of that compound that are involved when it changes into something else. For example, what's its reactivity with something? And what's its combustibility? Does it burn? Does it react with oxygen? There are other physical and chemical properties, but these are the ones that we'll deal with the most. In fact, with physical properties, we'll deal with boiling point and melting point, solubility and density the most, and with chemical properties, reactivity is the main one, and then we'll also talk a bit about combustibility. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about are chemical and physical changes. These are changes to the substance that are involved with either changing the substance or not changing the substance. For example, we have the two types, physical and chemical. Let's take a look at physical first. When we talk about physical changes, this is pretty straightforward. You're talking about changes a substance undergo when the chemical composition does not change. So for example, whatever you're doing to the compound, or the substance I should say, you're not turning it into something else. So for example, if you are talking about a piece of aluminum, you can cut the aluminum in half, you can bend the aluminum, it's still aluminum. If you're talking about something that undergoes or can undergo dissolving, like for example, if you take salt and put it in water and it dissolves, you still have salt, it's just in a different form. It's dissolved salt. Dissolving is one we will talk about quite a bit. The other one that we'll talk about a whole lot are phase changes. And this is the important part. The physical property or physical change that we'll talk about most is when something goes from either a solid to a liquid or to a gas. Any phase change is considered a physical change. Think about H2O. If you've got water in the solid form, we call it ice. If we melt it, it's in the liquid form, and if we boil it, it's in the gaseous form. But it's still H2O. We haven't changed its chemical makeup. On the other hand, when we talk about chemical changes, these are changes that substances will undergo, and the chemical composition does change. For example, if we were to take H2O and react it with something, say we were going to react it with ammonia, and we formed ammonium and the hydroxide, we've now changed the H2O into something completely different. So that's undergoing a chemical change. So when you take the compound or substance, change its chemical composition into something entirely new, we call that a chemical change. The two main chemical changes we will talk about are combustion and, let's just say, reactions or reacting. When something is undergoing a chemical reaction, That's the chemical change that we're interested in. Again, there are a few others, but these we're going to boil it down to those two. So again, for example, for what we talked about were physical and chemical properties, properties involved when the substance is not changing, properties involved when the substance is changing. And then we talked about physical and chemical changes, changes in a compound when it's not changing its chemical composition, changes in a compound when it is changing its chemical composition. The one thing you want to take notice, sometimes we use terms like compound, substance, molecule, there's a few others, and we kind of use those interchangeably. You want to differentiate between those, but don't get too hung up on the language as we're talking through these vodcasts. I'll try to be consistent with the semantics that we use. However, if you do have a question, don't be afraid to ask.